In the heart of a bustling city, where glass skyscrapers touched the clouds and success was measured in dollars and cents, lived a man who seemed to have it all. Robert Chen had built his real estate empire from scratch, turning a small inheritance into a fortune that made him one of the city's most influential figures. His wife, Linda, had been there from the beginning, working late nights at her teaching job to support them when they could barely afford their first apartment. 20 years of marriage had given them a beautiful life together, though not the children they'd hoped for. After years of trying and several failed IVF attempts, they'd learned to find joy in their life as a couple. Linda had thrown herself into her work, becoming one of the most beloved elementary school teachers in their district, while Robert expanded his business across state lines. But success had changed Robert in ways neither of them had anticipated. The long hours at the office, the business trips that stretched from days into weeks, and the growing distance between them had created cracks in their once solid foundation. Linda noticed the subtle changes, the missed dinner dates, the distracted conversations, the way his phone would buzz late at night with messages he'd quickly dismiss. She tried to bridge the gap, planning surprise lunches at his office and weekend getaways, but Robert always had an excuse. "The Jakarta deal needs my attention," he'd say, or "I can't leave the Singapore project right now." Linda would smile and understand, just as she always had, but the weight of loneliness grew heavier with each passing day. Then came Ashley Zhang, a bright young investment banker who joined Robert's company as a financial consultant. 28, ambitious, and stunningly beautiful, she represented everything that made Robert feel young again. Their late-night strategy sessions turned into dinner meetings, and dinner meetings evolved into something more. Robert found himself drawn to her energy, her fresh perspective, and the way she looked at him with admiration that reminded him of his younger days. Linda first noticed the change in his cologne. The familiar scent she'd given him last Christmas had been replaced by something different, something younger. Then came the new suits, the gym membership, and the sudden interest in health smoothies. But it was the lipstick stain on his shirt collar, hidden beneath his jacket one evening, that finally confirmed her worst fears. She confronted him one rainy evening as he packed for another business trip. The truth spilled out like water from a broken dam. Robert had been seeing Ashley for months, and he wanted a divorce. "I love her," he said, avoiding Linda's eyes. "She makes me feel alive again. We're going to start a new life together." Linda stood there, 20 years of memories crashing down around her. The small apartment they'd shared when they were young and broke. The celebration dinner when they'd secured their first major property deal. The nights spent planning their future, dreaming of the family they'd build together. All of it seemed to dissolve in the face of those three words, "I love her." "What about us?" Linda's voice trembled. "What about everything we built together?" Robert's response was cold, rehearsed. "You'll be taken care of. The lawyers will handle everything." He spoke as if discussing a business transaction rather than the end of their marriage. "Ashley and I are moving to the Singapore office. It's better this way, a clean break." That night, as Robert slept in their guest room, Linda sat alone in their bedroom, surrounded by photos of their life together. She found herself touching her stomach, remembering all the years they'd tried for a baby, all the disappointments and tears. But there was something she hadn't told Robert, something she'd discovered just days before finding the lipstick stain. After all these years, after all the failed attempts and heartbreak, life had decided to play one final card. Linda was pregnant, at 43, against all odds. The miracle they'd stopped hoping for had finally happened, just as their marriage was crumbling to pieces. As she sat there in the darkness, Linda made a decision. Robert had chosen his path, but she would choose hers. She wouldn't tell him about the baby, not yet. He'd made it clear where his priorities lay, and she refused to be the woman who used a child to hold on to a man who wanted to leave. The next morning, she watched silently as Robert packed his bags and walked out of their home, out of their marriage, and into his new life with Ashley. He left behind divorce papers, a generous settlement offer, and a wife whose world had just been turned upside down in more ways than one. Little did Robert know that his story wasn't ending, it was about to take a turn he never saw coming. As his car disappeared down their tree-lined street, Linda placed a hand on her stomach and whispered, "It's just you and me now, little one. And we're going to be just fine." The rain that had been threatening all morning finally began to fall, washing away the last traces of Robert's departure. Linda stood at the window, watching the drops trace patterns on the glass, knowing that this wasn't the end of her story, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. The first few months of Linda's pregnancy passed in a blur of morning sickness and paperwork. The divorce proceedings moved forward with clinical efficiency, just as Robert had promised. His lawyers were polite but firm, presenting document after document for her signature. Linda accepted the terms without argument, surprising both Robert and his legal team with her compliance. What they didn't know was that Linda had bigger concerns than property divisions and asset settlements. Her pregnancy, considered high risk due to her age, required frequent medical visits and careful monitoring. She'd already decided to step back from full-time teaching, taking an administrative role that would allow her more flexibility and less stress. Meanwhile, Robert's new life in Singapore with Ashley seemed picture-perfect, at least according to the social media posts that Linda's friends couldn't help but show her. Photos of them at rooftop restaurants, attending charity galas, and touring exotic locations filled their profiles. Ashley had quickly adapted to the role of a business mogul's partner, her youth and beauty making her a favorite among Singapore's elite social circles. But beneath the glossy surface, cracks were beginning to show. Robert found himself working even longer hours, the pressure to maintain his lifestyle and prove himself to his younger partner driving him to take on more projects. Ashley's expectations of their life together, the constant socializing, the public appearances, the expensive gifts, were draining both his energy and his accounts. Late at night, in the quiet of his luxury penthouse, Robert would sometimes find himself thinking about Linda. He'd catch himself wondering how she was doing, whether she'd started dating again, if she was happy. But pride and shame kept him from reaching out. Instead, he threw himself deeper into work and the whirlwind lifestyle that Ashley craved. Back home, Linda's body was changing, her secret growing more difficult to hide with each passing week. She'd moved out of their old house, unable to bear the memories that haunted every room. Her new apartment was smaller but warmer, filled with soft colors and the beginnings of a nursery she was slowly putting together. Her sister, Grace, had become her rock, attending every doctor's appointment and helping her prepare for the baby's arrival. "You need to tell him," Grace would say during their weekly dinner dates. "He has a right to know." But Linda remained firm. "He made his choice," she would reply, running her hands over her growing belly. "This baby and I weren't part of the life he wanted." As her 6th month of pregnancy began, Linda received an unexpected call from Mrs. Wu, Robert's mother. The elderly woman had always treated Linda like a daughter, and the divorce had strained but not broken their relationship. "Come to dinner," she insisted. "I miss you." Linda agreed, knowing she couldn't hide her condition any longer. When she arrived at the familiar family home, Mrs. Wu took one look at her and burst into tears. "I knew it," she whispered, pulling Linda into a gentle embrace. "I knew something was different about you the last time I saw you." Over a quiet dinner of homemade dumplings and herbal soup, Linda shared everything: the timing of her discovery, Robert's affair, her decision to keep the pregnancy to herself. Mrs. Wu listened silently, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "My son is a fool," she finally said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "He throws away gold to chase after glitter." She reached across the table to grasp Linda's hand. "But this child is a blessing, and I will not abandon either of you." That evening marked a turning point. With Mrs. Wu's support, Linda felt stronger, more certain of her path. The older woman became a frequent visitor, bringing traditional Chinese herbs for pregnancy and helping prepare for the baby's arrival. She shared stories of Robert's childhood, ensuring that Linda could one day tell their child about its father's better days. However, their peaceful preparation was interrupted one autumn evening when Linda's phone buzzed with an unexpected message. It was from Ashley, of all people. "We need to talk about Robert." The message sent Linda's heart racing. Had Robert discovered her pregnancy? But Ashley's next words suggested something else entirely. "He's not the man either of us thought he was." Linda stared at her phone, her baby kicking as if sensing her distress. After 20 minutes of internal debate, she replied with a simple, "Okay." Ashley's response came quickly, "I'm flying back next week. Can we meet?" As Linda set her phone down, she felt the baby move again. At her last ultrasound, she'd learned she was having a boy. A son who would have his father's eyes and, she hoped, the kind heart Robert had possessed before money and ambition had hardened it. That night, Linda sat in the nursery she'd created, rocking gently in the chair Mrs. Wu had insisted on buying. The room was almost ready, soft green walls, a white crib, and floating shelves filled with children's books. On the dresser sat a framed photo she couldn't bring herself to put away, Robert and her on their 10th anniversary, both laughing at some forgotten joke, their faces young and unlined by the worries that would come later. "Your daddy used to be a different man," she whispered to her unborn son. "And soon, it seems, we're going to find out who he's become." As she prepared for bed that night, Linda caught her reflection in the mirror. At 7 months pregnant, she was all belly, her petite frame making her condition impossible to hide. Soon, very soon, her secret would be revealed to the world, and to Robert. Ashley's mysterious message suggested that the carefully separated lives Linda had worked to maintain were about to collide. Running her hands over her rounded stomach, Linda felt a mix of anxiety and determination. Whatever Ashley wanted to discuss, whatever storms were brewing on the horizon, she would face them with the strength she'd discovered in herself these past months. After all, she was no longer just protecting herself, she was protecting the tiny life that depended on her, the son who would need her to be both mother and father until fate decided otherwise. The cafe where Linda agreed to meet Ashley was quiet, tucked away in a corner of the city where business people rarely ventured. Linda arrived early, choosing a secluded booth that would help conceal her condition. Her heart pounded as she waited, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. When Ashley walked in, Linda barely recognized her. Gone was the polished sophistication she'd seen in social media photos. Instead, Ashley looked tired, her designer clothes slightly rumpled, her perfect makeup unable to hide the dark circles under her eyes. "Thank you for meeting me," Ashley said, sliding into the booth. She paused, her eyes widening as she noticed Linda's condition. "Oh my God, you're pregnant," Linda finished quietly. "Yes." Ashley's hand flew to her mouth. "Does Robert know?" "No," Linda replied, her voice firm. "And I'd appreciate it staying that way for now." Ashley nodded slowly, then reached for her handbag. "That actually makes what I'm about to show you even more important." She pulled out a stack of papers, her hands trembling slightly. "Robert isn't who either of us thought he was." Over the next hour, Ashley laid out a disturbing pattern of financial irregularities she discovered while working closely with Robert's accounts. Hidden companies, questionable transactions, money flowing to offshore accounts. "At first, I thought it was just aggressive business strategy," Ashley explained. "But then I found this." She pushed forward a document showing a massive property deal in Jakarta, the same one Robert had used as an excuse to miss countless dinners with Linda. The numbers didn't add up. The project that had supposedly consumed so much of his time was largely fictional, a paper construct designed to hide something else. "There's more," Ashley continued, her voice dropping. "The Singapore expansion? It's not real. The company is bleeding money, and Robert, he's been using new investments to pay old debts. It's all going to collapse soon." Linda sat back, one hand instinctively cradling her belly. "Why are you telling me this?" Ashley's composed facade cracked slightly. "Because I was stupid. I fell for the dream he was selling, the successful businessman, the glamorous life. But it was all built on lies." She paused, gathering herself. "And because you deserve to know. The settlement he offered you in the divorce? Those assets might not exist in a few months. Does anyone else know about this? The authorities are starting to ask questions. That's why I left." Ashley's voice trembled. "I couldn't be part of it anymore. And I needed to make something right, even if it's too late." Linda absorbed this information in silence, years of memories shifting and realigning. The late-night phone calls, the mysterious business trips, the constant expansion, it all took on a different meaning now. "I'm sorry," Ashley said suddenly, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so sorry for everything. I thought I was in love with him, but I was in love with an illusion. You probably hate me, and you have every right to." Linda studied the younger woman's face, seeing not the seductress who had stolen her husband, but a girl who had been caught in Robert's web of deception just as she had been. "I don't hate you," she said finally. "We were both deceived, just in different ways." As they talked, Linda learned more about the Robert that Ashley had known, a man increasingly paranoid, prone to sudden anger, obsessed with maintaining appearances. It was a far cry from the gentle, ambitious man Linda had married, the one who used to bring her coffee in bed and dream about their future family. After Ashley left, Linda sat in the cafe for a long time, processing everything she'd learned. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Wu, "Come over for dinner. I made your favorite soup." At Mrs. Wu's house that evening, Linda shared everything she'd learned. The elderly woman listened with growing concern, her wrinkled hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I always wondered," Mrs. Wu said finally. "The way the business grew so fast, it reminded me of his father's warnings about building too quickly, reaching too far." She looked at Linda with worried eyes. "What will you do?" Linda touched her stomach, feeling her son's reassuring movements. "I need to protect the baby. If what Ashley says is true, everything could fall apart at any moment. The divorce settlement, the properties, all of it. Then we must act quickly," Mrs. Wu declared. "I have savings, my own money, not from the family business. We'll make sure you and my grandson are taken care of." But Linda shook her head. "I can't take your money. This isn't your burden to bear." "Family is never a burden," Mrs. Wu insisted. "And that child you carry is my family, regardless of what my foolish son has done." That night, as Linda lay in bed, she felt the weight of decisions pressing down on her. Her son would be born into a world very different from the one she'd imagined. Instead of a stable family with two loving parents, he would arrive amid the wreckage of his father's choices. Her phone lit up with a news notification: major investigation launched into real estate developers' financial dealings. The story didn't name Robert's company, but Linda knew it was only a matter of time. As she drifted off to sleep, Linda made a decision. Tomorrow, she would contact her lawyer. Not to fight for the settlement, that money might already be gone, but to protect herself and her child from the storm that was coming. Robert had made his choices, built his house of cards, and now the winds were rising. Her son kicked, strong and insistent, as if reminding her that whatever happened, she wasn't alone. "We'll be okay," she whispered, both to him and herself. Sometimes things have to fall apart before they can be rebuilt into something better. Outside her window, the city lights twinkled, unchanged by the dramas playing out behind closed doors. Somewhere out there, Robert was probably just receiving the news that his carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. Soon, he would learn about his child as well. Linda wondered which revelation would shake him more. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. Real estate mogul Robert Chen under investigation for massive financial fraud blazed across every business channel. Linda watched from her apartment as reporters swarmed the company headquarters, their cameras capturing employees leaving with boxes of personal belongings. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Friends, colleagues, even distant acquaintances, all wanting to know if she'd known, if she'd been involved. Her lawyer had called first thing. Don't speak to anyone. Don't post anything online. Let me handle everything. Grace arrived with groceries and a determined expression. You're not dealing with this alone, she announced, already heading to the kitchen to make Linda's favorite ginger tea. Have you heard from him? Linda shook her head, absently rubbing her 8-month pregnant belly. No, but... She hesitated, then showed Grace her phone. There was a message from Singapore. I need to talk to you. Please. It had come an hour after the news broke. Are you going to respond? Grace asked, setting down the steaming cup of tea. Before Linda could answer, another news alert flashed across her screen. Robert's private jet had landed at the city airport 30 minutes ago. He was back. I guess he's not waiting for a response, Linda said quietly. Mrs. Wu called next. He's at my house, she said without preamble. He looks broken. He's asking for you. Linda closed her eyes, feeling her son move restlessly within her. After everything that had happened, after all the lies and betrayal, Robert still expected her to come when he called. The old Linda might have done just that, rushed to comfort him, to help him find a way out of this mess. But she wasn't that woman anymore. Tell him, Linda said finally, that if he wants to talk, he can come to me. An hour later, a knock at her door made her heart jump. But it wasn't Robert, it was 2 serious-looking federal agents with badges and questions. They were polite but thorough, wanting to know about her involvement in the business, her knowledge of certain transactions, her role in the company's operations. Linda answered truthfully, her lawyer present via speakerphone. No, she hadn't been involved in the business operations. Yes, she'd been a shareholder through their marriage. No, she hadn't known about the fraudulent activities. The agents exchanged glances when they noticed her condition but didn't comment. As they were leaving, one of them paused. Mrs. Chen, you should know, your divorce settlement. Those assets are likely to be frozen soon. I'd suggest consulting with your lawyer about protecting your interests. Grace, who had stayed through the questioning, squeezed her hand. Money isn't everything, she said after they left. You've got your teaching career, your savings, and us. We'll help you. Linda managed a small smile. It's not the money I'm worried about. It's... She stopped as another knock echoed through the apartment. This time, it was Robert. He looked nothing like the powerful businessman who had left her for a younger woman. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face haggard, his eyes red-rimmed. He stopped short when he saw her, his gaze fixed on her very pregnant belly. How? He whispered, all color draining from his face. When? 8 months, Linda said quietly. I found out right before you left. Robert staggered slightly, reaching for the wall to steady himself. Why didn't you tell me? When should I have done that? Linda's voice was calm but firm. When you were telling me about your affair? When you were serving me divorce papers? Or maybe when you were building your business on lies? Grace stood up, gathering her things. I'll be right outside if you need me, she told Linda, shooting Robert a warning look as she left. In the silence that followed, Robert seemed to age years before Linda's eyes. I've lost everything, he said finally. The company, the properties, my reputation. Ashley left weeks ago. I thought I could fix it all before anyone found out, but... He looked at her with desperate eyes. I need your help, Linda. You're the only one who really knows me, who might understand. No, Linda interrupted, her hand protectively covering her stomach. "I thought I knew you. But the man I knew wouldn't have betrayed everyone who loved him. He wouldn't have built his success on lies. I did it for us." Robert burst out. "Every deal, every risk, it was to build the life we deserved." "Don't," Linda's voice sharpened. "Don't you dare try to blame your choices on our marriage. You did this for yourself, for your ego, for your obsession with success. And now—" She took a deep breath. "Now you have to face the consequences." "I'm going to be a father," he whispered, his eyes fixed on her belly. "Please, Linda. I know I don't deserve it, but please don't keep my child from me. Let me try to make things right." Linda felt her son kick, as if responding to his father's voice. "You're right, you don't deserve it. But this baby deserves to know his father, even if that father isn't the man I thought he was." She met his eyes steadily. "I won't keep him from you, Robert. But don't mistake that for forgiveness." Robert nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. "Boy?" he asked softly. "We're having a son." "I'm having a son," Linda corrected gently. "You'll need to earn the right to be his father." She paused, then added, "And you'll need to do that from wherever they send you after the trial." The reality of his situation seemed to hit Robert anew. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Outside, they could hear reporters gathering, someone having spotted his car in front of Linda's building. "They'll want to talk to you," he said finally. "The prosecutors. They'll offer you immunity to testify against me." Linda looked at the broken man before her, the husband she'd loved, the father of her child, the architect of his own destruction. "I'll tell them the truth," she said simply. "That's all I've ever done." The weeks following Robert's return unfolded like scenes from a movie Linda never wanted to star in. News vans camped outside her apartment building, forcing her to stay with Grace to maintain some semblance of privacy. Her inbox filled with interview requests from journalists promising to tell her side of the story, all of which her lawyer politely declined. The investigation into Robert's business dealings revealed a web of deception more complex than anyone had imagined. The prosecution's evidence painted a picture of a man who had started with legitimate success but had been consumed by the need for more wealth, more power, more recognition. Each questionable deal had led to another, until the line between right and wrong had blurred beyond recognition. Linda spent long hours with the federal prosecutors, telling them everything she knew. She watched security camera footage of Robert being led into court in handcuffs, his designer suit replaced by a simple dark blazer, his confidence shattered. The media called it the fall of a titan. Linda saw it as the crumbling of a facade that had been weakening for years. Mrs. Wu visited daily, bringing home-cooked meals and ancient Chinese remedies for Linda's increasingly uncomfortable pregnancy. "The baby is strong," she would say, placing her weathered hands on Linda's belly. "He kicks like his father did," before Robert learned to hide his feelings. One evening, as they sat in Grace's living room, Mrs. Wu shared stories of Robert's childhood that Linda had never heard before. "He was such a sensitive boy," she recalled, her eyes distant. "When his father died and left us with nothing but debts, Robert promised he would take care of me forever. He was only 12. She wiped away a tear. Perhaps that's where it began, this fear of not having enough, of not being enough. Linda's due date approached as Robert's legal proceedings intensified. His lawyers negotiated frantically, trying to secure a plea deal that would minimize his prison time. Through it all, he sent Linda daily messages, not asking for help or forgiveness anymore, but sharing memories, regrets, and hopes for their child. "I remember the day we met," one message read. "You were substituting in that business class, and you called me out for trying to explain economics to you when you actually had a master's degree in the subject. You weren't impressed by my success or my name. You just saw me." Another day, "I found the ultrasound picture from when we first tried IVF. I kept it in my wallet all these years, even after we stopped trying. I never stopped wanting a family with you. I just stopped believing I deserved one." Linda read each message but rarely replied. Her focus was on preparing for her son's arrival, working with her lawyer to secure her financial independence, and rebuilding her life one piece at a time. She had accepted a position as head of curriculum development at her school, a role that would allow her more flexibility with a newborn. Then, 2 weeks before her due date, Linda woke to sharp pains and a wet mattress. "It's too early," she gasped as Grace rushed her to the hospital. But her son, like his father, had his own plans. The labor was difficult. Hours passed in a blur of pain and worry as the doctors monitored both Linda and the baby's vital signs. Grace held her hand, Mrs. Wu prayed in the corner, and somewhere in the city, Robert sat in a holding cell, unaware that he was about to become a father. Their son arrived as dawn broke over the city, his angry cries filling the delivery room. "He's perfect," the doctor announced, placing the squirming bundle on Linda's chest. "A bit early, but strong." Looking down at her son's face, Linda saw Robert in his features, the shape of his nose, the curve of his mouth. But when he opened his eyes, they were exactly like her father's, filled with a wisdom that seemed centuries old. Mrs. Wu, who had been allowed in after the delivery, touched the baby's cheek with trembling fingers. "He looks just like Robert did," she whispered. "But he has your strength, Linda. I can see it already." As Linda held her son, watching him discover his own tiny fingers, a nurse appeared with a hesitant expression. "Mrs. Chen. There's a call from the detention center. Mr. Chen, he's asking about you and the baby." Linda looked at her son, then at Mrs. Wu, who nodded encouragingly. "Put him on," she said softly. Robert's voice was rough with emotion. "Linda? Is everything?" "We have a son," she told him, her voice gentle despite everything. "He's early, but he's healthy. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. 20 inches long." The sound of muffled sobbing came through the phone. "What does he look like?" "Like you," Linda answered truthfully. "But with my father's eyes." "I'm so sorry," Robert's voice cracked. "Sorry I'm not there. Sorry for everything. I know I don't deserve to ask, but, what's his name?" Linda looked down at her son, who had fallen asleep against her chest. She thought of all the names she'd considered over the months, all the possibilities she'd weighed. In the end, she'd chosen one that honored both his heritage and his story. "Benjamin," she said. "Benjamin Wei Chen. Benjamin for new beginnings, and Wei for wisdom," Robert finished. "It's perfect." He paused, then added quietly, "Thank you for letting me know him, even a little." As Linda ended the call, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The past year had brought more pain and change than she could have imagined, but it had also brought her this miracle, this tiny person who represented both endings and beginnings. The first month of Benjamin's life passed in a haze of sleepless nights and newfound joy. Linda discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, navigating midnight feedings and early morning colic while maintaining her dignity under the persistent spotlight of media attention. The story of the disgraced businessman's secret baby had captured the public's imagination, leading to endless speculation and unwanted publicity. Grace had temporarily moved in to help, turning the guest room into her temporary sanctuary. Together with Mrs. Wu, they created a protective cocoon around Benjamin, shielding him from the chaos that surrounded his father's approaching sentencing. "He has your determination," Mrs. Wu observed one afternoon, watching Benjamin struggle to lift his head during tummy time. "See how he doesn't give up? But that little frown, that's all Robert." Linda found herself studying her son's face daily, noting every feature that came from her and every expression that reminded her of Robert. Benjamin's eyes, so like her father's, seemed to hold questions she wasn't ready to answer. How would she explain to him, when he was older, about the complicated circumstances of his birth? About a father who had lost everything just as he gained his greatest treasure. Robert's sentencing was scheduled for when Benjamin was 6 weeks old. The night before, he called from detention. "I know I have no right to ask," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "but would you bring him tomorrow? I'd like to see him once, in person, before." Linda had anticipated this request, had wrestled with it for weeks. "Yes," she replied softly. "But not in the courtroom. I've arranged with your lawyers for a brief meeting before the sentencing." The next morning, Linda dressed Benjamin in a simple blue onesie that Mrs. Wu had bought him. The prison meeting room was cold and sterile, but she'd brought a soft blanket from home, trying to create some warmth in this harsh environment. When Robert entered, escorted by guards, he stopped short at the sight of them. Gone was the polished businessman who had once commanded boardrooms. In his place stood a humbled man in a borrowed suit, his eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in Linda's arms. "Would you like to hold him?" Linda asked gently. Robert's hands trembled as she placed Benjamin in his arms. The baby stirred, opening his eyes to study this unfamiliar face. For a moment, father and son gazed at each other in perfect silence. "He's incredible," Robert whispered, touching Benjamin's tiny fingers with wonder. "I never knew. I never understood what I was missing." He looked up at Linda, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you for bringing him. Thank you for giving me this moment." Their time was brief, just 15 minutes, but in that quarter hour, Linda saw glimpses of the man she had once loved. The gentle way he held their son, the soft words he whispered in Mandarin, the pride and regret warring in his eyes. As she took Benjamin back, Robert spoke quickly, "I've signed papers giving you full custody. My lawyers will explain everything. Whatever assets the government doesn't seize are yours, for him. It's not much anymore, but—" "We don't need your money," Linda interrupted softly. "Just be better. For him. Use your time to become someone he can be proud of." The sentencing itself was a solemn affair. Linda sat between Grace and Mrs. Wu, Benjamin sleeping peacefully in his carrier, as the judge delivered Robert's fate. 8 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 5. Restitution to his victims. The forfeiture of most of his assets. As the guards led Robert away, he turned for one last look at his family. Linda lifted Benjamin slightly, letting him see his son's face one more time. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement of the bond they would always share through their child. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Linda had refused all interviews until now, but something made her stop. Holding Benjamin close, she faced the cameras. "My son will know his father," she said clearly. "He'll know about the mistakes that were made, but he'll also know about the good that came before. He'll learn that life gives us second chances, but we have to earn them. Most importantly, he'll know that he is loved, unconditionally, by both his parents." That evening, as Linda sat in the nursery rocking Benjamin to sleep, Mrs. Wu brought her a cup of tea. "You did a brave thing today," the older woman said. "Both at the prison and at the courthouse." "I did it for Benjamin," Linda replied, watching her son's peaceful face. "He deserves to know the whole truth someday, not just what the media reports." "And what about you?" Mrs. Wu asked gently. "What do you deserve?" Linda considered this as Benjamin made small dreaming noises in his sleep. "I deserve to be happy," she said finally. "I deserve to raise my son in peace, to rebuild my life, to find joy again. And maybe—" She paused, "maybe someday I'll deserve to find love again too." Mrs. Wu nodded approvingly. The heart that can forgive is also the heart that can love again. Later that night, as Beijing slept soundly in his crib, Linda wrote 2 letters. The first was to her son, to be opened on his 18th birthday, explaining everything that had happened and why she had made the choices she had. The second was to Robert, not to be sent but to help her own healing process. "I don't forgive you yet," she wrote, "but I'm working on it. Not for you, not even for me, but for our son. He deserves to grow up knowing that people can change, that mistakes don't define us forever, and that love, real love, can survive even our worst choices. Make your time count, Robert. Become the father he deserves." 5 years passed like pages turning in a book, each chapter bringing new challenges and unexpected joys. Benjamin grew from a curious baby into a spirited kindergartner, his father's charm and his mother's wisdom blending in ways that constantly surprised Linda. The media spotlight had long since moved on to newer scandals, leaving Linda and Benjamin to build their life in relative peace. She had flourished in her role as curriculum director, eventually opening a small educational consulting firm that allowed her to work primarily from home. Their apartment, once a refuge from scandal, had become a warm home filled with Benjamin's artwork and the sounds of his laughter. Robert, true to his word, had used his time in prison constructively. He earned his master's degree in education through a prison program, tutored fellow inmates working toward their GEDs, and underwent extensive therapy. His letters to Benjamin arrived monthly, each one carefully written to be age-appropriate, never making excuses for his absence but always expressing love and hope. Linda read each letter carefully before sharing them with their son, watching Benjamin's face light up at his father's stories and questions. They kept a special box where Benjamin stored these letters, along with photos Mrs. Wu had given him of Robert's younger days. "Why does Daddy live so far away?" Benjamin asked one evening as Linda tucked him into bed. His room was a child's paradise, filled with books and educational toys, many sent by Robert after careful consultation with Linda. "Remember how we talked about making mistakes?" Linda began gently. "Daddy made some big mistakes with money and business. He's making things right, but that takes time. Like when you broke Mrs. Wu's special teacup and had to work to buy her a new one." Benjamin nodded solemnly. "But I fixed it. Will Daddy fix his mistakes too?" "He's trying very hard," Linda answered truthfully. "And soon, he'll be able to come home and show you himself." That soon was approaching faster than anyone had expected. Robert's exemplary behavior and genuine remorse had made him eligible for early release. The news arrived on a warm spring morning, just as Linda was preparing Benjamin for school. Next month, Robert's lawyer explained over the phone. "The parole board approved his release. He asked me to check with you first, about seeing Benjamin." Linda looked at her son, who was carefully packing his favorite dinosaur book for show and tell. These past 5 years had given her perspective she'd never expected to find. "Yes," she said finally. "But we'll take it slowly." Mrs. Wu cried when Linda told her the news. "I've prayed for this," she said, pulling Linda into a tight embrace. "For all of us to heal." The day of Robert's release dawned bright and clear. Linda had decided against taking Benjamin to the prison, choosing instead to have their first meeting in the familiar comfort of Mrs. Wu's home. She dressed Benjamin in his favorite blue shirt, the color that brought out his eyes, and tried to calm her own racing heart. When Robert walked through his mother's door, Linda barely recognized him. Prison had stripped away his material trappings, but something else had changed too. There was a humility in his bearing, a gentleness that reminded her of their early years together. Benjamin, suddenly shy, hid behind Linda's legs. Robert knelt down, putting himself at eye level with his son. "Hello, Benjamin," he said softly. "I've been reading about all the dinosaurs you like. Would you tell me which one is your favorite?" It was the perfect opening. Benjamin's face lit up, and soon he was sitting cross-legged on the floor with his father, explaining the differences between velociraptors and T-Rexes with the passion only a 5-year-old could muster. Linda watched them together, tears threatening to fall. Grace, who had come for support, squeezed her hand. "You did this," she whispered. "You gave them both a chance at something better." As the afternoon progressed, Linda observed the careful way Robert listened to Benjamin, never pushing, always following their son's lead. When Benjamin tired, Robert didn't try to force more interaction. Instead, he helped Linda gather their things, his movements measured and respectful of the boundaries she'd set. "Thank you," he said quietly as they prepared to leave. "For raising him to be so incredible. For letting me be part of his life, even from a distance. For..." He gestured helplessly, "everything." Linda nodded, her voice gentle but firm. "We'll take this one day at a time, Robert. Benjamin needs stability and honesty. Can you give him that?" "I'll spend the rest of my life trying," he promised. In the months that followed, Robert proved true to his word. He found work teaching business ethics at a community college, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. He attended every one of Benjamin's school events, sitting quietly in the back, never pushing for more than Linda was willing to give. 1 year after his release, as they watched Benjamin play soccer in the park, Robert turned to Linda. "I know I lost the right to ask this long ago, but, are you happy?" Linda watched their son chase the ball, his face glowing with joy. She thought about the life she'd built from the ashes of her marriage, the strength she'd discovered in herself, the wisdom she'd gained through pain and healing. "Yes," she said simply. "Not in the way I once thought I would be, but deeply, truly happy." Robert nodded, understanding all she hadn't said. "I'm glad. You deserve that. Both of you do." As the sun set over the park, casting long shadows across the grass, Linda reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The betrayal that had shattered her world had also freed her to build something new. The pain that had nearly broken her had instead revealed her strength. Benjamin ran over, proudly showing them the goal he'd scored. His smile, so like Robert's yet uniquely his own, held all the promise of tomorrow. In his eyes, Linda saw the future, not a fairy tale ending, but something real and honest. A story of redemption, forgiveness, and the kind of love that survives even our worst mistakes. "Mom," Benjamin asked as they walked home, holding both his parents' hands, "can we get ice cream?" Linda laughed, catching Robert's eye over their son's head. In that moment, she saw not the man who had betrayed her, nor the prisoner who had served his time, but simply the father of her child, doing his best to make amends. "Yes," she said, squeezing Benjamin's hand. "I think we all deserve a little sweetness today."